So will I share my screen?
You can, yeah.
Yeah, so we should be recording right now, and if you want to get your slides ready, whatever you want to do, I'm going to start getting the live streams going.
See a few people trickling in now.
And we should be live on Facebook now.
Okay, great. We've got a few more minutes before we kick off here, waiting for more people to kind of come in. Stephen, can you hear me? Oh my God. Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. A speaker is not working. I'll just ignore that if you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Great, thank you. One of the panelists said they could hear me as well. Sorry, one of the attendees. Okay, we'll just wait another minute or two and see. Well, thank you everybody for coming today. And we're really excited about this event. Um, and I'll just introduce myself. My name is Brenda Oslowski, and I'm with Islanders for Proportional Representation. We're a local group that formed after the referendum last year. I want to thank all the other members of our group for helping plan this. Marie, Fred, Leo, Florence, Chris, and Donna. And special thanks to Stephen DeGrace, who is manning the controls in the back and making this all possible, because none of the rest of us have the technical skills, frankly. But so big thanks to Stephen. I also want to thank Willie Sullivan, who is with the Electoral Reform Society of Scotland, and thank him not just for appearing today, but also for his interviews that he has done. And so I'm just actually. Sorry about that. So Willie Sullivan is the Senior Director of ERS Scotland and Campaigns, and he's worked at senior levels in the business, voluntary, and public sector. He was a campaign consultant on the successful Fair Share campaign for the introduction of single transferable vote, or STV, which is another type of PR, for Scottish local government, and was campaign director for Vote for a Change, the campaign to secure a referendum on electoral reform. He was seconded to be the head of field operations for the Yes campaign in the UK-wide alternative vote referendum, which is not a PR, but it's just keeping everything the way it is and using ranked ballots. He has also been a paid political advisor to senior politicians in the UK and the Scottish government. So I really want to thank Willie for being here today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Brenda, and thanks to Islanders PR for organising this and asking me to come and talk a bit about Scotland to you. I mean, obviously found out a little bit more about what's going on in Prince Edward Island and electoral reform through doing these interviews over the last week, and I think it's quite fascinating and quite encouraging. I think that you've had 3 referendums, and it's clear that people like Brenda and Stephen and Mary, believe this is the right thing, and are determined to keep arguing and pushing for it. These changes, as I think, as you'll see as I talk about it, are very difficult for reasons that the status quo always benefits the powerful and those that hold power at that moment. So it's very difficult to get change, that kind of determination and persistence is what's needed. And as we always say in Scotland, change begins at the edges, and I think Prince Edward Island is a good place for this sort of change to happen, and a very important shift, I would say, and hopefully you'll see why I make that point after my presentation. So I'm just going to do 3 separate things. I think I'm going to talk about the kind of story of how we got electoral reform in Scotland, and I think it's good to kind of understand that it's a lot about political culture, and the political culture of the past and the political culture you have now, but also the political culture you want to create for the future. What your ambition for the political culture of your place or state or nation or province is. And it's also really, as you will have found, quite difficult to argue for changes like electoral reform because they're very seldom happen on their own. They're part of bigger changes and shifts, and it's quite hard to separate out when things start to get better, it's quite hard to point and say that that was because of electoral reform. And that's why I kind of will probably end on a political discussion about culture and values and stuff that we want from a political system. So to start us on that journey, quick political history of Scotland. Scotland became part of the United Kingdom 1700s. With 1703 was the Union of the Crowns, and then shortly after was the Union of the Parliament. It's quite interesting that the king that was the monarch that united the crowns was James Stewart, who wrote a book on the divine right of kings, which kicks off this idea of the political culture that we had here in Britain was from the top down, because the divine right of kings said that the legitimacy of the monarch comes directly from God, and that's where his right to rule over everybody else comes from, and it does create a kind of top-down idea of government, and it's persisted for a long time, and it's still there. I mean, obviously, the people don't think that the Prime Minister of Britain or well, some people might, but gets his legitimacy from God, but he is a very top-down, centralised system of government that we have here. And then quickly to skip over the next 300 years, we had the kind of shared interests really of Scotland and England, in that an empire, industrial revolution. Scotland was a massive industrial, central belt of Scotland particularly was a massive industrial powerhouse, and shipbuilding, steel, coal, and then we moved into the second half of the 20th century, deindustrialization, and that had political consequences in this 1970s and 80s, as the kind of shared and mutual benefits of the end of that period. With the end of industrialization, we had the Thatcher government, which was a conservative government, deindustrialization, big conflict with the trade unions, particularly with the miners' union in the 80s, and at the same time we had the rise of a home rule movement for Scotland. So Scotland started to begin to say, well, we'd be better to run our own affairs, to have our own government, and get away from this kind of centralised Westminster model. And then as the 1990s came along, there was more of a devolution movement for power to be devolved from Westminster to Scotland, and that resulted in a constitutional convention, which was a convention of kind of the players in Scottish society who didn't really have the power of a parliament, but had kind of moral authority and some institutional authority as well. So the trade union movement, the churches, the civil society sector, and the political parties came together and designed. So there was a move for a parliament, and they designed a parliament that they thought was an improvement on Westminster, and that was a parliament that was elected under a proportional system. And there's always, I always say, there's always things only happen, big things only happen in politics when there's more than one reason for it. And the reason for the PR position was because the ruling parties of the UK, both the Conservatives, but more importantly Labour, because Labour was so dominant in Scotland at that time, didn't want SNP to ever get a majority, but they didn't want their own party to get a majority either, because that was an alternative power base to Westminster, where these decisions were being made and where Labour hoped to rule and shortly did, because in '97 there was election of New Labour, and they'd made with Labour winning every constituency in Scotland apart from one at that time. So it was a complete wipeout of the Conservative Party and all other parties in Scotland, partly because they made that pledge, I think. And then so shortly afterwards, the referendum for devolution for a parliament was held with a significant yes vote, and for the parliament to be elected under PR. That was then elected in 1999, the first parliament in Scotland for 300 years, elected under PR. It was a Labour Liberal Democrat coalition at that point. How things have changed, but it also went on to bring legislation to bring PR into local government because of the power play between the Lib Dems, who'd always had policy on PR, and that was something that they demanded of Labour actually in order to vote with them in government. And in 2007, we had local councillors elected under STV, which is single transfer vote, which is a form of PR. So this is the process of democratisation of Scotland in a way. It's not the only thing that has made a big impact in Scotland, as I said. So it's quite difficult to separate it out. But as we go through, hopefully I can explain why I think it's some big steps forward for us. This is just a photograph of the chamber of the Scottish Parliament, which was constructed shortly after that vote, and is a horseshoe parliament. I wouldn't say that it's all consensus and joint working, because it isn't, because it's a highly contested, politics is a highly contested thing. But the question is, like, can it manage those conflicts and contests better or worse than Westminster, for example? So just to say a bit about the system that we use for the Scottish Parliament, it's called the Additional Member System. This is from ERS's website, and we kind of rank different electoral systems, and there's no perfect system, right? There's always, I think I said in one of the interviews over the week, there's trade-offs, for and against all systems, and you got to decide on what you're willing to give up and what you're willing to get. But I think, as I said in that interview, what we've found is the people that lose things are mainly the political elite, and those that tend to, political power tends to concentrate. That's the kind of nature of it. So, and democracy has the task of trying to distribute it again. So I think we build these institutions to do that. Our parliaments and our assemblies and our voting processes and other democratic spaces should be about trying to rebalance that concentration of power. So the additional member system, what happens is Scotland has constituencies. So just as the MPs are elected to Westminster, or I'm sure your representatives are elected in Prince Edward Island, they're first, what we call first past the post. The person that gets the most votes gets elected. So Scotland's divided up into 73 constituencies, and then there's a 56 what we call top-ups. So it's divided into the 73 constituencies, and they're all elected under first past the post. And then there's regions where another 7 MSPs are elected from, and they're elected by the second vote. So what happens, here's a ballot paper. You vote for your constituency member, that's the pink side of it, and then you vote for your party there. You can see the kind of richness of the amount of choice that voters have. It doesn't just force you into a two-party choice. We've got 4 big parties actually in Scotland, 5 really, because we've got the Greens as well, but they're only elected off the list. So people have a lot of choice. There's at least 5 different programmes that they can vote for, and many more that stand on the list but don't often get elected. So we've got the Republican Party, smoking rooms and pubs. We can also see there's some quite extreme parties on there that have never got into the Scottish Parliament. So this argument that PR allows far right or far left parties or any extreme parties to get in is not our experience in Scotland. And I think if you design the system well, it won't be. There's the British National Party, which were a fascist party, and they never got anywhere in Scotland. They got much further in in England than they ever got here. So yeah, you vote for the party list, and then there's a system called de Hont, which reallocates the list seats to make sure that the parliament is roughly proportional with the votes cast. So Labour gets 20%, they get roughly 20% of the seats. SNP gets 45%, roughly 45% of the seats. Those aren't exact figures, those are just examples, but they're round about that. Okay, so as I said at the beginning, you know, you can make arguments for political systems about how many women get elected or how many BME people or how many classes get elected, but it's actually very difficult to separate all that stuff out. I mean, the Scottish Parliament did have nearly 50% women's representation, much better women's representation than Westminster, but it's hard to say that was because of PR. So I think we have to kind of ask ourselves kind of deeper political questions about how we want to be governed. What is the culture and values of the sort of government we want? And while, well, let's think about this time. You know, we've got the pandemic, we've got crisis of democracy. A Cambridge University study last week said that millennials have real decline in their trusted democratic system, something like 55%, a big increase on this, on what you know, other generations think. This is a steady decline of a crisis of democracy, and that's a real worry, because as we know, the alternatives are probably not good. We have the climate breakdown, and our local issue, which is independence Brexit, highly divisive and very difficult to manage through political institutions. But I would suggest to you that Scotland has managed it reasonably well, and a lot better than I think Westminster has. It's hard, again, it's hard, you can't really claim that for PR, but I would say that the type of governments that you need to deal with these problems, these are problems that the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, where I've done a bit of work, would call adaptive problems. They're not obviously defined. It's not obviously to say, well, that's what that problem is. We all know what it is. We all share an analysis of it, and therefore there's a technical fix to it. They need adaptive solutions, and the processes of government of arriving at those solutions, I think, are very different from the type of government that first past the post gives you. And I'll say a little bit about that now. And again, I'm not claiming these things are entirely what, you know, the products of electoral system. They are a lot about political cultures, political histories. But I would say this, that a proportional system of elections is insufficient for a creation of a 21st political culture, but it's a necessary condition. It's very, very difficult to create the sort of political culture which I think we need to solve those. Or I'm sure you have similar adaptive challenges on Prince Edward Island as we have here in Scotland, which will be local to you. But just to think for a second about what is the political culture that you want, even if you don't have it at the moment, even if so we argue for reform at Westminster. Westminster does not have the political culture that I think we have here in Scotland. And Scotland's in no way perfect, but it's just the easiest comparison to give it. Under proportionality, we have you're forced to have coalitions and consensus. You're forced to have adaptive leadership. Whereas in first past the post, you can see these big hero ideas of leadership are there. They're there in Trump. They're there in Boris Johnson, but they're failing as well. They might have worked in the past, but I think, you know, technology is actually what's changing everything, and what is made that kind of way of doing government, which might have worked in the past when nations could share one narrative, even if it was contested at the margins. It's, you know, overall there was one shared view of what the nation was, and there was a spectrum upon values, and there was a kind of agreement on what was true and what wasn't, and that's all fractured. It's fractured because there's just so many different. Elites can't control narratives anymore, although there's huge amounts of spending and huge amounts of attempts to control narratives, but it's not possible, and therefore I think you need different type of politics, and the basis of that is a proportional electoral system. It allows for honesty about moral and value trade-offs, whereas first past the post, it's not true that in a proportional system you won't get dishonesty. Of course you do, but it's what it skews towards. It's what it kind of makes it more possible. It makes it more possible for you to be honest when you've got a parliament made up of lots of different people lots of different parties having to work together, having to make compromises, having to surface and show the compromises. They're not made behind doors, and they're not presented as being a kind of moral certainty. Then I think that's what's allowed with that, and that allows more trust as well, because voters know now they have much more sources of information, and they just kind of know that things are not as straightforward and simple, and although they might want them to be. I mean, this is what populism is. Populism is a gross simplification, but I do think that our societies and our politics are only really going to progress when we get into that kind of levels of complexity, nuance. Things are not wrong or right, black or white, yes or no, winners or losers. They are nuanced and difficult, and I think, as I said, proportional systems are at least a starting point to creating that type of politics. So, just to come to a conclusion, what can Scotland tell you about electoral systems? I think it says, well, why wouldn't you have an assembly that is made up of representatives that are in proportion to the way that people voted? Why wouldn't you do that? I mean, that is just logical, fair, reasonable, something that voters can see and trust. And the reasons that you find it very difficult is obviously that there's a lot of reasons given not to change by the status quo and by those that have benefited from the status quo, and they always throw up, whether it's the construction of the way that the referendums are run, or whether it's the arguments and the straw men that they put up for why it can't change. The truth is, if you look at Scotland, it can. It can, and we're a perfectly functioning 21st century democracy with PR for our parliament and PR for our councils. And I'm not claiming this for PR at all, but look at government trusts, and there was the Scottish Attitude Survey last month. 67% of Scots think that the Scottish government has their best interests in dealing with COVID, and I think it's 15% think the Westminster government do. Now, there's all sorts of stuff in there, and I'm not claiming it for PR, but there is more trust in our government here than there is at Westminster, and at least some of that is to do with PR. And I'll go back to the point that why wouldn't you have a representative parliament when there's no good reason not to, other than the false claims or machinations of those that want to keep things the way they are? Thanks.
Thank you, Willie. Sorry, I'm a bit slow in getting back on there. So I'm just forgot to do a bit of housekeeping right at the beginning. So if you have questions for Willie, I'm going to just do a very short kind of presentation, 2 or 3 or 4 slides, just kind of explaining the local perspective here, which may aid Willie when he's answering your questions. And if you do have questions, if you could enter them in the Q&A section on the bottom of your screen there. We have 2 questions already, and I'll kind of monitor the questions. And if there's a number of people asking the same question, I'll group them together. And I just wanted to let people know that we are recording this session, and it is going to be on Facebook, and you can access it also on our website, and we'll send out a notice to people on our social media. So I'm just going to share my screen here, just do that, and whoops, there we go. Oh, nothing's happening here. Okay, I'm going to just try that again. Anyway, I might just have to, just have to go from my desk here. I'm not really sure why this is not, we'll just start from current slide and see if that's better. Nope.
I could see it a minute ago there, Brenda. It was there and then it went.
Is it on there? Can you see
I think you're on the end. You're on the end of it. So if you just start.
Okay, so let me go up here.
Yeah, there it is.
There we go. Okay. So basically, the referendum results in 2005, we had 36% people voted in favor, which is about 11,000 votes. And then, whoops, sorry. And then in 2016, 52% voted in favor, and we almost doubled the number of people supporting PR. And then in 2019, although we did not improve on the percentage, because it was during a provincial election, and we could go into all kinds of things about the dangers of plebiscites and referendums, but the important thing to note is that we almost doubled, well, we did more than double the percentage of people who voted in favor of a proportional voting system, which is, considering all of the constraints, I think was frankly just amazing. So in 2016, you can see the results. Those that voted no were blue or dark blue, and the area on the west end of the island is where we kind of had the most resistance or the least support to the idea of adopting PR. And that was certainly the case in 2019, although this map doesn't show the real reality. I think almost all of the other ridings, aside from those 3 in the West End, we had a support of over 45%. I think there might have been one in the East that was just over 40, but everywhere else was 25%. The 3 ridings in the West End were in the 20s. And so one of the big arguments has been the loss of rural representation. And that may be, I'm sure that question will come up for Willie about how that was addressed with MMP that was adapted for Scotland. So that has been kind of our biggest barrier. And we've had a number of other questions, like things like unstable governance, frequent elections, and that cumbersome public policy that'll be cumbersome to get legislation passed and to have decision making. But we've heard from Willie that this would not be the case, and if you read the CBC interview of his interview, he made a very compelling argument there for the stability and the fact that Scotland has really only had elections every 4 years. So the reasons for having PR in our mind would be that almost everybody is going to cast a ballot that will help to elect someone, regardless of where you are in the island. Right now in provincial and federal elections, over 50% of people will cast a ballot that does not elect anyone. Does not elect anyone. And that's a shocking number, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's hard for people to really kind of to believe in the authenticity of an elected government. Legislatures that reflect the diversity of the community, you know, we would just be ecstatic if we got 40% even, but 50% women elected to our legislature would be phenomenal. I think right now we're at 20 or 25%, I can't remember, but the percentage of women elected has traditionally been very low on the island, and you know, that seems to be something that PR countries are better at doing. We're hoping that, well, although it would be possible for a party to get a majority, we believe that with the new kind of political landscape on the island from the last decade or so, where smaller parties are getting a larger share of the popular vote, that there will be fewer instances where one party will get a majority of the seats, and that false majorities would be much, much less likely. And we believe that there would be better deliberative processes of policy, decision-making with collaborations with other parties, that it would allow all kind of stakeholders to be at the table when policy is made. And that if everybody feels that they're casting a ballot that's helping to elect someone, that there be a stronger democratic engagement in the community. Although the island is pretty phenomenal as far as democratic engagement goes. And a way to maybe get around the idea of trying to get past this idea of having some kind of public mandate for the introduction of PR, you know, that we modify what MMP implemented and then try it out for maybe 2 election cycles or 8 years, and then vote on it again, much the way that they did in New Zealand, where they implemented it and then had a referendum to kind of confirm that people felt good about where it was going. So the current need of PR movement and PI is kind of to dispel the perception that people are sick of this issue, that we don't need it, because now, as we see what's happening south of the border, but even as we've seen a number of coalition governments work effectively in New Brunswick and on the island and just nationally, that that coalitions can manage difficult situations well. And that a lot of the opposition comes not necessarily from party members, because we've had, being on the board of Fair Vote Canada, when we polled the public, we found that even people who are Conservative Party members support the idea of proportional representation, of having a parliament or a legislature that reflects how we voted, that allows everybody to cast a vote that will help to elect someone. And that it would start to cut the ties between patronage and feeling that you're having to elect a vote for or hope that in your district the ruling party is elected, because then you will be able to get services. I remember when I was campaigning door to door, somebody said, yeah, but you know, if I don't vote for the party that's in power, we won't get our road paved. And, you know, those kinds of you know, kind of tie-ins that you have to vote for the winning party, to know that, you know, when you vote in a PR system, that that the government that results will look out for the best interests of all islanders and not just the ones that voted for them or considered to be their supporters. So we need some kind of way to move forward. And I like the idea that that Willie had mentioned before, but politics tries to concentrate power, and that democracy is a task of redistributing it. And maybe that is something that we really need to communicate with the public and see if that can, you know, bring forward more kind of calls for openness and transparency, that policy is made at the table amongst a number of parties and not in the party back rooms, which is one of the concerns of PR, strangely enough, that complaints was that it would lead to policy being made behind closed doors. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to just look at the questions here. Okay. The first question we have is, while door knocking for PR, comment often received was it would take government too long to make policy, too much negotiating. And what was Scotland's experience regarding this when PR became a reality? So I guess, Willie, if you can maybe also, since you're in a situation where you can compare Scotland, the way the decision making is happening in Scotland, in the parliament there, and the way it's happening in the UK in their parliament, that might kind of provide some, I guess, kind of a way for us to gauge what it might look like to have decision making under a PR system.
Yeah, I know this is the argument that's often used, but it's just not had any experience of it whatsoever in the way that the Scottish government makes decisions. And it's if you look at how Westminster tried to decide on Brexit and the stray, you probably weren't aware of the detail. I'm sure you weren't, but the kind of way that motions were put and counter motions and stuff, and just the whole mess that went through Westminster, it just, I mean, that argument doesn't hold water in any way whatsoever. That because our government, as I said, is not perfect, and it takes time and doesn't always make the right decisions. But there's certainly not a feeling that things are held up. Just as the whips have to negotiate within their own party, and it's parties under first past the post systems are just coalitions, but they're untransparent coalitions. They're massive coalitions of different interests, and that negotiation goes on within the parties, but it's not public, it's not seen. They've not stood on platforms because they've only stood on one programme for the whole party, but there's different elements within the party that have probably got different platforms and programmes that they want to negotiate within the party. So it's just not my experience. And when I see how whips offices operate, I don't know if you have whipping systems with your parties there, but I'm guessing you probably do. Then the internal coalition is probably just as, if not more, difficult for them to negotiate, and is certainly not as transparent, and haven't been elected. They haven't nobody's voted for those internal programs within these big catch-all parties.
Okay, I did have another question, but I wasn't quite sure what they were getting at. So if anybody else has any more questions, I'm going to we have some questions that we did prepare, and I'm just going to go to some of those. One of them is a lot of concern, from Florence, a lot of concern here is around larger districts, with people seeing that as having less representation. And part of the problem is no one seems to know what the 9 island reps or list reps will do, and who or what they will represent or be responsible for. So I guess if you could explain to us how list MPs or candidates work once elected. Are they spread across Scotland, and how do they take the load of the of representation?
Maybe I'll put the slide back up, so I can show that. It's this one. Okay, just go back to it.
So you have regional lists.
Yeah, so we have regional lists. So I'm guessing just by geography and population, you would have one list for the whole of the island. That's what's been suggested?
Well, again, we didn't have much input into what options of PR went into the plebiscite, and the winner in the plebiscite was what went into the referendum. Again, when you're trying to have something win a referendum, you don't know, should I keep it simple or should I have more complicated? Because you're having to kind of educate 160,000 people on how, so it is island-wide, but maybe something that could be proposed is that we have regional lists as opposed to an island-wide list.
Yeah, well, I would say that that concern about what do the additional members do, because they don't have a specific constituency in the way that was known. I mean, they have a big region, but that died away after the second term, because they took on issues. They ended up sharing offices. So you'll see, like, in that there's Mid Scotland and Fife. There was one Green, 2 Labour, and 4 Conservative. They kind of shared offices and spread out with the other MSPs of their party. So they kind of they supported them, but they also did region-wide stuff. And you also see there that out of the, and this is just about, so this is this idea that a system of PR does not represent rural areas, because we have a very highly, most of the people in Scotland live in the Central Belt, which is, the West Scotland, between the 2 estuaries there. You'll see where the white bits are missing in the centre of Scotland, because that's the cities, and that's where most people live in Scotland. But 4 of the list areas are outside of that, so they're in rural areas. So it's just about, in some way, how you design your system. I would say rural areas of Scotland have much better representation under this system than they ever had under the MPs going to Westminster. So I mean, if you want to balance representation, so that where areas of huge population are not dominating the political life of your country or your province, then you just have to build that into the design, and that's what was done here. And if there is a great thing about that opportunity for change, is that you can update anything where there is any imbalances or unfairness over and above the fact that first past the post is unfair. Then that's an opening for you to do it.
Okay. So, and it has it done away with safe seats?
It's not done away with safe seats. Well, safe seats have gone, but it's hard to say that it was necessarily. Well, I mean, it was to do with PR, but not in a systemic way, in a political way that opened the politics up, that Labour did not dominate in the way that it did. There was a third party of choice. And I think Labour would, if Labour was honest about what happened to them in the last election, where they got defeated in the north of England, was that there was a whole group of voters who had voted Labour throughout, and then had never got anywhere else to go. Whereas in Scotland, they could have went to the SNP or the Greens, and then they went to the Conservatives because it was the only place left. They felt let down and let down and let down, or not represented and not represented. So, parties have got to be careful that if they limit the choice to just two sides, then people are eventually going to shift over to them. I mean, well, that's what happened here anyway. So I think that that choice it did away with safe seats because the SNP came up because one of the big problems with first past the post is there is no point in voting for anybody else in a safe seat, or there is no point for voting for anybody else in a state that's dominated by one party, as Scotland was. I mean, I don't think you have that same problem yet. But as soon as you open that up, and then there's a point or a chance to vote for somebody else that your vote might count, then suddenly you open it up to that choice, and then safe seats have become a thing of the past. There is no safe seats in Scotland now, and it's maybe indirect, but there definitely is. You can argue for a relationship between that and the proportional system.
Okay. This might be, I know that you've said before that it's hard for you to, or you feel that you can't necessarily draw a correlation between the use of MMP or PR within Scotland and any kind of effect like electing more women, or whether the gap between the rich and the poor is smaller, or any of those kinds of things. We did have somebody ask a question about I believe whether the gap between the rich and the poor is smaller in Scotland than maybe in the UK because of the use of PR. Have any research been done on anything like that, or?
I mean, there hasn't, because it's not really possible. I mean, there is correlation for sure, but there's no way you can argue causation. I mean, I know why. One of the reasons I mean, it provides opportunities would probably be the best thing that you can say, because you know, the parties could say that they're only going to have, you know, women on their slate for the list, or they're going to zip the lists, which is what happens sometimes, as you have a man and a woman and a woman and a man, and some of the, like, Labour Party does that. But because these were new constituencies in the beginning, Labour made sure that they twinned their constituencies, and I worked for the Labour Party at the time and ran quite a lot of these selections, that every twinned constituency was a man and a woman. So that's what drove the 50. That's what drove it. I mean, the opportunity was given by the change, but there is, you know, zipping lists is a is a good way. It opens up, it gives you more chances to do that. But it is up to left down to the parties. I don't think, unless you go for quotas, and we do a lot of work at the Electoral Reform Society on women's representation as well, unless you go for quotas, there isn't really a political system that will, you know, this is not a technical fix for all sorts of these issues. These are big cultural political issues. And I think that's a point I'd like to make. PR is a technical fix, right? It's a technical change, and it needs to be located within a wider adaptive problem about the crisis of democracy and, you know, the problems for women's representation or other groups' representation. You know, it's not enough on its own, and I think if you just argue for it as a technical fix, then it causes you difficulties. You have to put it within that context of, you want a different political culture, and this is one of the ways that help you get it. It's not the, you know, silver bullet.
Okay. One of the things I was going to ask was, we haven't, there's another question popping up there while I'm reading that. I'll just ask you, has there been any talk of modifying or adjusting MMP, for example, using open lists, or changing it so that false majorities are not possible? Because I know that the Scottish National Party got a majority of the seats, but I believe it was a false majority. They had something like 45 or 46% of the vote. Has there been any talk like that?
When that happened, I mean, I think it was around about 48% of the vote. When that happened, there was, and there's actually an easy fix for it. You just change from the D'Hondt system to the Sanlong system. It's just a different way of allocating the second preference, the second votes. It's more, but I'll be honest with you. Most, you know, it's different, and we would certainly argue for open lists because the power of patronage that the parties have within. Although there's been a lot. I mean, when I worked for the Labour Party in the first '99 election, the party leadership decided who was going where on the list, and party members didn't put up with that for very long, and it was opened up to elections and rule changes and stuff. And I think the same within the other parties, that the party members place them. But obviously, we know how party apparatchiks work, and they try and get the leadership's way on these things. But so there is argument for open lists. Hopefully that will come one day. But I think it's still quite a young institution as parliaments go, 20 years. And people are quite happy with it. I mean, as I said, the 60-70% satisfaction ratings with the government, which is a government that's been in power for 3 terms, and that's not all the electoral system, but those are astounding figures for government satisfaction. But I think we can claim something for PR here, and it is that the Greens are part of that. People feel that the government does have to govern for everybody because it knows that it depends on the second votes. There's no safe seats. Labour's collapse in Scotland was partly to do with this idea that they took everybody for granted because they had all these safe seats. You can look at the we did this survey on party spending and campaign spending, and all these safe Labour seats that have now gone to the SNP. You can see all that. If you look at that map, all the yellow on there, that most of that was, especially the Central Belt, was all red not that long ago. They never spent anything there because under first past the post, those were safe seats. Where they spent the money was in key marginal constituencies. Where they aimed the policy programme was not for ex-industrial areas in Glasgow and the Central Belt and the mining communities in Fife. It was at swing marginal seats in posh areas of Edinburgh. That's where the policy was ended. That's where the spending was done. And eventually, they say these people just said, well, they're not aiming policy at us because they're taking us for granted. We're safe seats. They're not spending money on us in campaigns. Well, they didn't know that. That was only our survey that done that, and they just had enough. And this system, they could vote on the list for SNP. SNP built up, a credible position on the list system, and then suddenly they swept the board on the constituency seats. And if you look at that map as well, you would see that, and if that was a first past the post election, the SNP would be completely in control. Scotland would have been independent. All these people, over 50% in the last referendum that voted not to go independent, would have no representation. But because we have a proportional system, they get their representation on the list to make up the proportionality, and that has, whether you're a supporter of Scottish independence or not, it shouldn't be done without the majority of the people supporting it. And that SNP government, if it had been elected there, it wouldn't care about all these people who had voted for Conservative and Labour. Because they don't need them. They don't need them to dominate Scotland in that way, but they do need them under the additional member system.
Okay, so you do have a closed list, and because that has been one of the big complaints here, not just on the island, but in Canada, is that we just have given up on closed lists. We've had to advocate for open lists because everybody kind of feels that it's backroom boys and it's party hacks that'll end up on the list. But you're saying that the SNP, the Scottish National Party, really built up their credibility by having an open and transparent method for populating their lists, and that was part of the reason why they
they built up their popularity through being, through having a credible programme and being credible political representatives, which they would never have got a chance to do when Labour dominated that. Or it might have all swung at once as well. Who knows? It's quite hard to do these counterfactuals. But yeah, they built. But yeah, closed party lists are not good. And I guess if we were to redesign this at the time, we wouldn't want closed party lists. But they're not as bad as they were at first, because people woke up to the fact that the parties were trying to stitch them up. The membership didn't wear it. People didn't like it, so they knew that voters probably didn't like it as much as they understood or knew about it. But certainly the party members didn't wear it. So it's not ideal. I think you're right to try and argue for something better than closed party lists, but it's better than first past the post for sure.
Okay. Somebody's just asked, so the white areas on the that's Labour, the white areas, is that correct, on the constituency seats? What are the white areas? Or those are like the urban areas that have a lot of, we can't kind of actually see the bottom of the...
Can you not see the bottom of it?
No, so the one is, I gather, one is Glasgow urban area and the other is Edinburgh urban area. So they got a number of ridings there, and you've got a blow up showing all the...
I think you call them ridings and we call them constituencies. So there's a number of... The thing is, they're just too small to show in the map because they're too concentrated. So they're just outtakes of the map. So most of them are SNP as well, apart from Orkney, which are Liberal Democrat. But you can see there's one Labour seat in Edinburgh and one Conservative seat in Glasgow.
Okay. Well, we'll take your word for that because it's being cut off.
That's a shame.
Anyway, so now we have some other questions. Okay. Well, I'll just actually go back to the list of questions here and just so now during elections, is policy more clearly laid out and adhered to during an election campaign? One of the things that we find is that policy is often changed in first past the post elections, that it's changed on the fly to target swing voters and strategic ridings. So would you say that the policy is more stable, that it's posted, everybody knows what the policy is, and parties have very definite personalities or policy platforms? I mean, one of the problems here, I think, in some ways, somebody said a while ago that I remember hearing somebody say that in a lot of ways, Liberal and Conservative parties on the island are fairly similar. It's hard to kind of distinguish the platform differences between the two. And we had the thing, for example, where often let's say the Liberal Party nationally may kind of all of a sudden swipe the NDP party platform or parts of it, and the NDP is kind of like a left Labour kind of party, and the Liberal Party is kind of central. So I'm just kind of wondering if you have any comments about if a party platform changes during elections with MMP, or if having a PR system, knowing you can't win swing votes that way, has eliminated that practice.
I mean, I don't know what the exact kind of political situation is there, but for sure here there's a group of voters, and they were kind of the same demographic, who were swing voters, and they were kind of upper middle class. They were better educated because and they would swing between different parties, whereas traditional Labour, working class, industrial areas would stick with Labour because that was the only option they had at that time. And therefore, as I said earlier, there was no need to target policy for them. They were in the bag and taken for granted. So there's a really narrow kind of group of voters that policy was aimed at. This is still true in the across the UK. They often have kind of marketing terms for them, like I mean, you've probably heard them like Mondeo Man or supermarket mom or whatever. And they kind of try and segment the population that way and just target their policies at them, ignoring the rest of the electorate and taking them for granted. So that is done away with under this system. You have to chase as many votes as possible. So you need to try as much as possible to offer a balanced platform and appeal to many. What that does as well, or should do, although I think we probably went so far down the road with first past the post that it's going to take a long time to build that back up, is there's a whole group of voters, and I did quite a bit of research on this and wrote a book about it, that feel, you know, that policy has not been targeted at them, public spending has not been targeted at them. It doesn't matter who they vote for, it doesn't make any difference, so they just stop voting. And I did a lot of focus groups with people in the East End of Glasgow and parts of Dundee, people who didn't vote, and that was what they said. There's no point, you know. They are using my vote to legitimise them, and then I haven't done anything for them. And that was talking about all the parties, because, and that to me was a effect of first past the post and this kind of very narrow targeting of policies that swing voters and swing constituencies. I don't know if that you have that in Prince Edward Island. It'd be quite interesting to know if there is a kind of narrow demographic that all the parties are chasing.
Well, maybe not so much on PEI, but I know federally that there's a lot of that. Now, we are kind of up on time, but what I was going to do is kind of close with one question and a final question. Basically, the UK has not adopted PR despite seeing it work effectively in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and so can you tell us what the main arguments against PR are in the UK for the UK elections, and you know, how aware they are that Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales are using PR systems?
Yeah, well, the main arguments are not so much arguments as kind of political realities, in that turkeys don't vote for Christmas. So, you know, the incumbents do not want to risk changing from a system that has given them power, and the two big parties, although Labour has moved more towards this than the Conservatives, have kind of got this kind of Buggins's turn approach to politics. So they would much rather govern as a majority in the Parliament, even though they're only getting 30 to 40% of the popular vote, and that's what they know and what they're used to. So it's the political reality of, you know, existing status quo power, and how do you shift that? And that the media and others have always, you know, and no, because that sort of entrenched power is not only about the legislature or the Parliament. You know, there's networks of relationships that go into the City of London, that go into the media, that go into the whole establishment of Britain, and so it's very, very difficult, as you've probably found, to kind of shift that, maybe on a smaller scale, but it's difficult to shift that. So, I mean, I think the Labour under Keir Starmer is probably shifting a bit towards that, and we'll see. But to let you know what those, I mean, I think there's straw men, the arguments, but there is arguments that are used by those that oppose it, and they're arguments like strong government. Although we had, you know, we had you know, complete debacle under a majority government in Westminster about Brexit. You know, we've had coalitions because people voted for coalitions, and even under first past the post, which is really hard to do, but people voted to break the system. There is arguments about far right parties as well coming from the left, but I would suggest to you that post-Brexit, the UK Independence Party were, quite an extreme right-wing party, and what happened was that those policies got taken on by the Conservative Party. So, some people would argue there's extreme MPs at the moment. They're just not. They're sitting in the Conservative Party. So the idea that you can keep extremists out, but just by first past the post is not true. We don't have extremist parties in Scotland, and or New Zealand. I think an interesting thing about New Zealand, despite Jacinda Ardern winning a majority, she wanted to do coalition with the Greens because she's used to doing that type of politics, and she knows that type of politics is what's needed. So again, I think this is one of the stepping stones to a much better political culture, and a political culture that is much better at solving these big adaptive challenges that we have in the 21st century. The steam age politics, it's first past the post is out of date and not fit for purpose in the 21st century.
Well, thank you so much, Willie. I want to thank you for sticking with us, because we had to try and reschedule this during the pandemic, and you've been just fabulous. And I want to thank all the attendees, and thanks especially to Stephen for making the Zoom happen, and to all the fellow volunteers on IPR, especially to Marie Birch for helping me with my short presentation there. And so I think we'll sign off, and we'll send out an invite to people to see our recording of this event.
Thanks to you all.
Thank you.
For asking me. It's a real pleasure.